All right, welcome, kids. I'm broadcasting from home today. It's a Saturday afternoon, and I thought I'd just cover the last half of Nazi Germany. All right, so in review, we looked at how the Reichstag fire and aftermath signaled the beginning of the consolidation of power of the Nazis in 1933. um, the passage of laws such as the Enabling Act, which gave the Nazis temporary dictatorial power. One of the things that I stress, though, is once you give a regime anything temporary as far as power, good luck getting that power back. All right. In the mid 1930s, Mussolini was still the predominant fascist leader of the two, but over time, leading up until the later 1930s, Hitler had surpassed him as far as prestige and power, become the more dominant of the two. But at the time, at least early in their relationship, Mussolini was still seen as the senior of the two. The Night of the Long Knives that happened in June, July of 1934 consolidated Hitler's power within his own party and within the country, eliminating rivals within the political Nazi party, but also people outside that could challenge him. Specifically, leader of the SA, Ernst Röhm, and then certain other politicians that had challenged him. Hindenburg dies later that summer, August, I believe, of 1934, and Hitler takes the title of president and consolidates with his own title of chancellor and becomes the Fuhrer, the leader. Later in 1935, there was a passage of the so-called Nuremberg laws, which were the racial purity laws, specifically by law outlining what constituted a Jewish person, how much so-called Jewish lineage did you need in your blood in order to become a Jew, what was not a Jew, what was the so-called, they call them Mischlinge, or, that's literal for half-breed. So how much of Jewish blood was meant before you became legally a Jew. Couple videos you can watch. This one is Germany and the Nazis, ranging from 1918 to 1949. It's about a 10-minute documentary. This is another 7 to 8 minute clip on life in Nazi Germany. Like I said, go back to the slides and watch that if you like. The one on the left in red is the Alberta Learning advocated video on fascism. It's an 18-minute video on what fascism is. And then the second video is more of a Google, YouTube kind of video on fascism. So feel free to watch those. All right, as you can see here, conformity to the state ideology is demanded and is achieved through such measures such as, okay, so that's one of the things you have to understand in fascism, is that you have to conform. So in a way, it's a very collective way of thinking. Extensive organizations, I guess you could call it kind of a federal type system, but they all work together under the direction of the national organization. The youth, okay, were put into groups in order to bring about, um, indoctrination. Okay, there wasn't any group or very few groups that were left outside of the so-called National Socialist umbrella. So, doctors associations, teachers associations, workers associations, and then the various youth groups, whether for men or women. Obviously, there was a secret police, okay, the Gestapo, that would round up people and send them to work camps for re-education. Extensive networks of people working within those organizations. Education, the curriculum was completely geared towards indoctrination. Okay, the media was censored. The media became a vanguard of the state, where it would promote the good deeds of the state. And any kind of dissent would be not tolerated, not broadcast, suppressed. Lots of scapegoats. Okay, the regime was never at fault. there were reasons why Germany wasn't doing as well, both externally and internally. And uh, that was one of those methods that dictators used to secure and keep power. All right, so let's look at the economy real quick. Hitler and the economy. How does Hitler and the Nazis turn the economy around in such a relatively short period of time? As you can see here by the stat, there were over one quarter of the Germans unemployed in 1932. But within a few years, there were only 1 million unemployed. That was a huge turnaround. And I'm not here to give Hitler and the Nazis credit for what they did, but at least economically, they were able to turn that economic feature around. And there were a number of reasons for that. The use of public projects, such as the building of roads and rearming the military, stimulated the economy. They had these coined words for a lot of these programs, like beauty of work program, strength through joy, the building of the highway system called the Autobahn, the national vehicle called the Volkswagen. Okay, workers groups belong to like labor fronts, national food estate, etc. And another thing to think about is that the people that were very wealthy at that time, industrialists that worked in Germany, were probably more than happy to invest behind the Nazis, because the alternative, the communists, would have uh, completely taken away their wealth and redistributed it to the state. And so it was kind of their so-called deal with the devil. Lots of subsidies were given to farmers. Imports were restricted, so there was this protectionism that went on, uh, production quotas, controlled prop. And so, if you're looking at all these aspects, I think you need to think to yourself, this sounds somewhat collective in nature. Okay, we always think of the Nazis as this extreme right wing, but at least economically, they had a lot of socialist type of tendencies. Now, their socialism, it could be argued, was national socialism, whereas in theory, the communists and the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union had international communism, but in many ways, their communism was very national too. Yet, workers had few rights. Industrialists benefited from banning of unions and protests. The National Economic Chamber organized workers into 7 groups: crafts, tourism, energy, industry, commerce, banking, insurance. Okay, this chamber ensured all aspects of the economy were loyal to the state. So it's not like if you belong to these organizations, you were going to get better benefits and you were going to get better working conditions and better pay. It was more about keeping them coordinated and keeping them on the right track. I mean, and certainly there would be some, uh, you know, aspects that would make people want to work harder, but most of it was this intrinsic idea that you needed to make the state better. Okay. In most cases, women were not allowed to work outside the home, and couples received payment for each child that they had. Just a little bit about those Nuremberg race laws that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. In 1935, they passed these race laws. And like I said, feel free to watch the video clips that deal with some of the stuff. It goes into a lot more detail than I will. All I'm doing is just kind of hitting the high points and trying to get you to understand what are some of these concepts you need to remember. So once again, the so-called screws were being tightened tighter and tighter and tighter upon the populace of Germany. The Jewish people were deprived of citizenship, and open discrimination was allowed. By 1938, businesses and homes were confiscated. The Jewish children were expelled from school. People that worked in uh, business or in teaching professions or in government jobs, if you were Jewish, you were fired. Okay. Eventually, the eugenics program was put in place. And this whole idea of eugenics was this 19th into the 20th century idea that you could basically breed the best features into others and you could take out the worst features in other people. And the Nazis fully embraced eugenics. Ironically enough, eugenics was a principle that was fairly popular even in our own country, our own province, for heaven's sakes, up until the middle of this century. So encouragement of pure blood Aryans to have children together. You were given a basic amount to marry, and then another basic amount for each child, and you received this token medal for achieving 8 kids. Women were discouraged from working. Okay. And then over time, undesirable groups began to be marginalized and eventually, especially once the war began, to be eliminated. And you can see all the list of people that were undesirable in Nazi Germany, including Jews, Roma or Gypsies, communists, African Jehovah Witnesses, Soviets, homosexuals, the disabled, and Polish. All right. One of the ways in which you can create a consolidation of your power and stability over time is that you can indoctrinate the youth. And so the youth were put into these groups in order to indoctrinate them. Boys, they went into these groups similar to the Cubs and Scouts. Um, they went into a group called the Young Boys and then eventually into Hitler's Youth. Girls, young maidens, where they were prepared to become domestic housewives. All right, we talked about the Nuremberg Laws. Here are some of the laws that were passed in 1935. Marriage between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood are forbidden. Marriage concluded in defiance of this law were void, even if for the purpose of evading this law, they were concluded abroad. So if you were German and married a Jew, it was null and void, even if you were married in the United States. Extramarital affairs were forbidden between Jews and subjects of the state of Germany. Um, Jewish people were forbidden to display the Reich or national flag. Okay, so they were basically considered non-citizens. All right, so feel free to read in your textbook for a little bit more explanation on these so-called Nuremberg laws. But once again, this is another example of the rejection of liberalism. They're rejecting people on the basis of equality. They're pigeonholing people on the basis of race, ethnicity, etc. Here's just a diagram of the progression of where men and women went in Nazi Germany. Once again, the whole idea about these groups was indoctrination of the youth, um, convincing them of the merits of the regime, etc. Said the whole point of boys was to pigeonhole them into either military roles, industrial roles, etc. And for women, it was about making lots of babies, okay, and rearing children so that they could grow up and make the Third Reich even stronger. All right. And children were encouraged to report inappropriate behavior. All right, women and youth. Nazi Germany was a patriarchy dominated society. Women were primarily to stay at home and raise children, which I had previously mentioned. Couples, once again, I think I mentioned this, were rewarded for having children. And Nazis saw the importance of young people as the future of the Reich, which I had already previously stated. Okay. Anyways, and like I said, if uh, the children could identify that their parents, who were not as indoctrinated as they were not adhering to the aspects of the state, they were encouraged to, literally tell on their parents. All right, here's your quintessential picture of the, let's see if I can just exit this for a second. So this is a couple diagrams of the so-called ideal Nazi woman and ideal man. Okay, once again, the ideal Nazi man, his role will either go into three main groups. Maybe he's a politician, maybe he's a soldier, or maybe he's a worker within the Reich. Okay, whereas the role of a woman in Nazi Germany was to have as many babies as possible and raise them. Okay, so in that way, it's very right wing, very traditional in that aspect. Okay, this is a video, a Disney documentary called Education for Death, outlining in a very Disney like way how the young person within Nazi Germany eventually becomes a completely indoctrinated Nazi. Okay, pretty good little video. It was produced during World War II as, ironically enough, a propaganda video against the Nazi regime, made by the Allies, obviously by Disney. So let's just go into some history. Eventually, Hitler started to break aspects or sections of the Versailles Treaty in his rearming of Germany. So they started or stopped repaying these reparation payments that had been agreed by the Versailles Treaty, then once again with the Dawes and Young plans. Okay, began rearming their own country, beginning rearming their own air force, rebuilding it. In 1936, they reoccupied the Rhineland, okay, the area of Western Germany that had been agreed upon under the Versailles Treaty that the Germans were not to occupy militarily. They just went in at some point in 1936. The thinking was if they meet any resistance, they'll leave. But this was the period of time where the European powers were practicing this policy of appeasement because they just didn't want to get into another war. There was World War fatigue, all the way up until the late 1930s, until it became inevitable that they had to do something against Hitler. But still, by the mid 1930s, these nations were appeasing. Austria, the country in the south of Germany, was annexed by 1938, even though this was forbidden under the Versailles Treaty, the whole Anschluss. But yet, by 1938, the countries combined, nothing really was done to stop it. Another couple examples of, where Hitler and the Nazis felt that they were wronged by the Versailles Treaty and they were just going to take it. So I've talked about this whole Anschluss. Like I said, you could read this, but this is where Austria was now taken over by Nazi Germany and going against the Versailles Treaty. Uh, just another example of the European nations doing nothing or doing very little to stop this aggressive, non-liberal entity from becoming bigger. I'm just like I said, you go ahead and read this. So now Germany is even greater, and now they have Austria, which now they have pretty much consolidated Central Europe as far as their power. The high point of appeasement now occurred later on that year when Hitler now wanted the western portion of Czechoslovakia. And this high point of appeasement culminated in the Munich Agreement of September and October of 1938. All right, once again, it was done to avoid a full scale war. The European powers, France and Britain, among others, did not want to fight another world war. The prime minister at that time, his name was Neville Chamberlain, met with Hitler, and it was agreed that Germany would not make any military advances in Czechoslovakia. A vote or a plebiscite was held in this area of Western Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, and more than 50% Germans were eventually annexed by Germany. Britain and France had promised to protect the sovereignty of the Czech country, Czechoslovakia, after World War I, yet the decision was made without a representative. So this Munich Agreement happened in 1938, in which the British and the French and the Italians said that Germany could take over the western portion of Czechoslovakia in exchange that the Germans would assure to them that they had no other means or desires to push forward. All right. Once again, the whole idea of appeasement is that you are giving in to the demands of an aggressive nation, hoping they're going to be satisfied. The problem with appeasement, especially with a non-liberal entity, is that that's the way they live. That's the way they survive, is through taking and taking as much as they can. The only language it seems that they understand is power. They achieve through power. The only way they can be stopped is through power. All right. At the time, the signing of this agreement was actually celebrated in Britain. Neville Chamberlain, with his famous we have peace in our time" speech. But it didn't take long for people to realize that um, it was a paper tiger, so to speak, that uh, it wouldn't hold up. So here's a map of this so-called area in Western Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Here it is right here. Okay. This area in green is that area in which Hitler had wanted. Okay. And you can also see the ethnic breakdown of people within Czechoslovakia. It's a virtual smorgasbord of ethnicity. So around the western areas, you have lots of Germanic people living there, and so they had an affinity towards Germany. Whereas in the more of the interior, you had the Czechs. To the east, now you had the Slovaks. To the extreme east, you had the Poles and the Ukrainians. All right. So, like I said, Neville Chamberlain forevermore is now the term appeaser. And this is a famous uh, cartoon by Dr. Seuss, basically saying that, the whole idea of appeaser is that you're going to be the last one that they're going to feed on, but they're never going to be satisfied. They're never going to be satiated. So, like I said, this is just the whole thing about appeasement, who was involved in appeasement. Problem with this particular agreement, though, is by just a few months later, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. So within just a few months, he breaks his promise not to have any more designs within Czechoslovakia, and he goes on and takes more of Czechoslovakia. At that point, I think the Western nations realized 100% that this man could not be appeased, and so they had to draw a line in the sand. The problem was, more than likely, they took too long. They allowed him to rebuild his military, rebuild his infrastructure, and he became too strong for them to easily handle, or at this point, handle at all. Back internally, now you have the Night of Broken Glass, the kind of the culmination of pre-World War II treatment against the Jews in Nazi Germany. Of course, in German, it's Kristallnacht, but in English, it's the Night of the Broken Glass. November 9th, 1938, a massive coordinated attack on the Jews occurred through the German Reich. Mob violence broke out as regular German police stood by and crowds of spectators watched. Nazi stormtroopers, along with the members of the SS, beat and murdered Jews, broke into and wrecked their homes, as well as torturing Jewish women and children. 25,000 men, Jewish men, were sent to concentration camps. The thing about this event, it was sparked by the assassination of a Nazi diplomat in Paris, I believe, by a Jewish person who felt that the Germans were mistreating the Jews in Germany. So this was a government coordinated mob attack on the Jewish people in Germany. And it was a pretty big stain on the German population, even into World War II. And so it was one of the things that spurred the final solution, in which they did a much more organized destruction of the Jewish people, not this random, violent, overt, out in the open kind of action. So right before World War II starts in August of 1939, the Nazis and the Germans secured their Eastern Front by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin in August of 1939. And I think you should be able to understand the reasons why they did it. Okay, the world was shocked. What are the Nazis, the fascists, and the communists doing signing a peace treaty? Okay, well, they were ideological enemies. I basically call them thugs that wanted the same proverbial piece of the pie, so to speak. These terms were about dividing Poland. Germany would take the western portion of Poland, and then the Soviets would come in and take the eastern portion of Poland. Pretty much, the Germans wanted to be able to attack Poland without feeling that the Soviets were going to feel intimidated, and also was going to give them a little bit of time to attack to the west. Okay. Why would the Russians sign this? Well, once again, they didn't want to get invaded by the Nazis. And, perhaps at this time, their infrastructure was severely weakened by the extensive amount of purges that were occurring up until the later 1930s by Stalin. I mean, he killed hundreds of thousands of his military leaders, people within, uh, that institution. And so it was like proverbially cutting the head off of that institution. They were just not ready to fight. And they were still going through their industrialization, the 5-year plans. They were not at a point where they could fight back. And, they felt like they wanted that piece of Poland back. They had lost that after World War One. So World War II begins on September 3rd, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Within a couple of days, sorry, that happened on September 1st, 1939. Within a couple of days, the British and the French declared war on Nazi Germany. Here's just a look at the German and then the subsequent Soviet invasion of Poland. Poland was pretty much taken over within 2.5 weeks by both these huge armies. So going and well, the whole World War II isn't so much in the curriculum, and you can watch lots of videos on World War II. But I'm going to get back to some domestic issues going on in Nazi Germany. So theories of racial superiority. Nazi ideology included a racial theory that claimed that Germans formed a superior so-called Aryan race. They also used the Jews as a scapegoat. They directed popular discontent. They claimed that many Jews were the cause of Germany's problems. Anti Semitism was not unique to Germany. Many Christians blamed the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus. Once again, I had previously mentioned this whole idea of eugenics, that you could breed certain desirable traits out or undesirable traits out of people and breed certain desirable traits into people. One of the high points of this whole idea of getting rid of the Jewish people occurred in January 1942 with the Wannsee Conference, in which members of the Nazi Party, the infrastructure, uh, laid out a plan on how to get rid of the Jews. And basically, it came down to that they had to send them to camps, and eventually using substances like Zyklon B, cyanide, and crematoriums, that they would eliminate them. I mean, they thought of different plans, sending them to places like Madagascar, sterilizing them, etc. But they came to the conclusion that the only way that they could get rid of the Jewish question, and they like to use euphemisms all the time, was actual euthanasia. So over the course of the next few years, up to 9 to 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, were killed by the SS and the Nazis. Now, to the right here on the screen, there's a movie that came out in 2001. It was called Conspiracy, which documented or depicted this Wannsee conference, in which they just sat around and talked about the pros and cons on how to eliminate the Jews within Europe. And they came to the conclusion that it had to be through euthanasia. So the Holocaust occurred, coincided with what was going on in the world, and that's the madness of it. The Germans are fighting this battle against eventually the Russians and the Americans and the Canadians and the British, but at the same time they're fighting this battle of killing 6 million Jews. It's crazy. The so-called final solution or liquidation of all Jews, Gypsies, and most Slavs within Europe, including all who oppose the Nazi Party. Death camps were created to rid the Third Reich of the unwanted. Okay, death camps came out of the work camps. Okay, one of the more famous Nazi death camps was this place called Auschwitz, where 12,000 people a day were killed. 67% of the Jewish population in Europe eventually was destroyed, was murdered. Over 90% of the Jewish people within Poland itself and Germany were murdered. We can see the stats here: 6 million Jews, 10 to 11 million Slavic people, so Russians, Poles, Czechs, etc. Up to 3 million Russian prisoners of war, a million gypsies, a million homosexuals, etc. Okay, so these are people that were just outside of war. 21 million people were killed during this time period. One of the places in which they sent the Jews were kind of a temporary place until they could send them to camps were the ghettos. And one of the case studies that you could look at was the Warsaw Ghetto. The ghetto was first established in 1940, so a year after the war began, when its estimated population was 440,000. People were deported to concentration camps. The population decreased eventually to 70,000. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest of all the ghettos in which the Jewish people were sectioned off from the rest of the population. They would take, 16 square blocks of a city, in this example would be Warsaw, and they would place hundreds of thousands of Jewish people crammed in there, literally like sardines, until they could be taken to work camps and eventually death camps. It was filled with disease and starvation, and the people who lived within it were in constant fear of random killings. Like I had previously mentioned, Germans, Jews, Gypsies, whatever, were sent, at least initially, to concentration camps located in various places throughout Germany prior to and during the war. They were built to torture the people within and use them as cheap labor. Housed political prisoners and undesirables such as Jews and outspoken journalists. Camps became larger to house more prisoners after the start of World War II and became more vicious. Deeper into the war, the prisoners began being used as medical experiments under German doctors. The most famous of these guys, his name was Joseph Mengele, one of the chief doctors at Auschwitz. Like I said, concentration camps either got converted to or these just sprung up, these so-called death camps. Were built in World War II and were used for the sole purpose of executing people as efficiently and quickly as possible. The largest of these so-called death camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau. Okay, the largest camp meant for the sole purpose of killing was called Chelmno, and the predominant substance that these death camps used was this uh, substance called Zyklon B, in which people would be uh, placed into these um, bathhouses, so to speak, or at least these fake bathhouses. Um, they'd be told to take off their clothes. They're going to go in and take a shower. They'd be locked into these places, and then the Zyklon B, once it hit moisture, would vaporize, and within a few minutes, people would literally suffocate to death. Okay, but until then, it would be excruciating pain. What would happen is that when the workers would come in after um, to clear out the bodies, that they basically build themselves this huge mound trying to get out of this enclosure. Just a terrible way to go. Here is a map of the locations of the various death camps. You can see literally dozens of these places. Most of the so-called death camps were housed outside of Nazi Germany in areas of Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. Okay, these ones here you can see are extermination camps. You got Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, like I said, Auschwitz right here. Okay, a lot of the more concentration camps were located in the western portions. A very, very well made, great movie on the Holocaust was made in 1993 by Steven Spielberg by the title of Schindler's List. I believe it's on Netflix. Uh, Very adult in nature as far as its content, but I would uh, fully recommend it that you watch if you want a gritty look at uh, the themes of hatred, but then eventual the triumph over evil. Please watch this movie. But I do warn you, there are a lot of disturbing scenes in this movie. But one of the there's not a lot of movies that really move me to tears. I'm such an emotional guy. I cry all the time. You can just see I'm just a guy full of lots of emotion, but I'm bawling like a baby watching this movie. So, anyways, I fully recommend. So to sum up, living with Nazism, how did ideologies that rejected liberalism affect citizens? Any benefit, and this is one of my summations, that came out of this ideology was, in my opinion, outweighed by the devastating costs to many of the people living in these countries. I mean, tens of millions of people died, because they either supported or had to support the Nazi regime. While some citizens benefited, at least initially, most people either suffered or died. Final question. Is it reasonable to suggest that the rejection of liberalism can be dangerous for citizens? I mean, living in a modern liberal society as we do in Canada, I suppose I'm trying to tell you that when you reject liberalism, that there can be some pretty dire consequences. A video that I've shown from time to time. I don't know if you can find it online. It's called Life Under Hitler. There are other videos um, that I have shared with you that are very similar that you could watch. This is in your textbook, the whole cult of leadership, the so-called Fuhrer principle. Okay, the idea that Germany and Hitler are one. It's very similar to what Louis XIV said when he said, "I am the state." Okay, is this whole cult of personality. So if you look at it, what are some of the aspects of the so-called Fuhrer principle, this total allegiance? Well, ultra nationalism, okay, where Germany is more important than anything else. And since Hitler is Germany, then Hitler's more important than anything else. Okay, this whole idea of living space, Lebensraum, you need war in order to promote this Lebensraum, establishment of a Central European empire. The whole marrying, I call it the corporate estate, the marrying of big business, the government, and the military. So If you're a rich industrialist, you can make a ton of money under Nazi Germany as long as you're doing the things the regime wants you to do. Okay. They're very collective in nature. Okay. You do your job, you do your role. Don't think outside the box. Let the leadership make those decisions for you. Okay. Anti liberal. Okay. Power needs to be held by the executive and the executive only. The whole idea that democracy and people have a say is wrong. Okay, very Nietzschean in that way of thinking. And as far as Nazi Germany goes, and to a less extent with Italy and some other fascist states, this whole idea of racial superiority. Okay, this whole idea that you can breed good aspects into people and you can breed out bad aspects into others. So this would be the kind of overarching Fuhrer principle. This is a video that kind of goes through World War II, fairly short and sweet synopsis. Another brief overview of World War II. But like I said, there's tons of material on YouTube. Man, I would have loved this as a kid. I think this is the last slide. So um, I might later today make another video, but I'll get this loaded up and I'll talk to you later.